可以看到。
Okay, 我现在想给他 play mode。OK， 好的，好，非常有高兴呢，有机会呢和大家在这里呢，来探讨这个问题。我呢实际上刚才介绍的有一些呢，其实漏掉了一个特别自我介绍的时候漏掉了一个特别重要的信息。我是 mother of two， 2个孩子的妈妈，他们也都是在英国长大的。现在呢，2个孩子都在上大学期间呢。I'm actually enjoying 这个 sometimes I have this 就是这个空巢的这种 syndrome, but I'm actually enjoying freedom. Okay, so this is all the talk also are some reflections on my own experience as well. 我希望今天有机会跟大家一块探讨，所以大家可以呢随时打断我，然后如果有问题的话呢，咱们可以及时的交流。I'm going to start with a very irrelevant question, a seemingly irrelevant question. 我想呢，就是先给大家问一下一个好像一点都不着边的问题，是什么呢 ？What do you have for Christmas Day? What is your main dish for your Christmas? 大家圣诞节的时候会选什么样的大餐呢 ？Is everybody who make this decision, and is everybody happy with the choice?有没有
I think it might, yeah, I could say something. I'm also in North England. 我也在英国北部哈。我们的圣诞大餐可能每年不一定一样，但是比如说去年就刚刚过去的这个，我们是做了 Yorkshire Pudding， 大家都很高兴。但是肯定也会有一些别的吧，有一些炒菜，Yorkshire Pudding， 对
，Brilliant, yeah. Who make decisions? Who actually make decisions?Did you make this decision to go for your
whoever? Yeah, I think yes, but I think the decision was influenced by my daughter because she enjoyed it at school. Oh no, yeah, and we kind of have a taste of it, homemade Yorkshire pudding from our neighbor. So and we all like it, so we decided, yeah,
very
not
very
necessarily good. Chinese food, I would say.
That's brilliant. What did you have together with Yorkshire pudding? Is it turkey or
no, not turkey. We follow quite strictly, but we don't like turkey, so we follow quite strictly of the BBC recipe, the traditional way of serving it. You know, sausage and chicken, roast chicken.
Roast chicken and
roast
sausage.
Potato.
Roast
potato
with
rosemary. So very
brilliant.
Probably more. I think my friend from Yorkshire would be surprised to be served with such really kind of traditional Yorkshire pudding way.
Yeah, brilliant. Yorkshire pudding for people. I mean, some people may not actually know it's a pudding. It's really like, I always think it's like 油条, similar. Maybe I'm wrong. The taste is similar, but it's a round one. There's a hole in the middle. You can put things in it, and sometimes I've seen giant one before, really big one. Yeah, and it's a really nice goal. It's actually often have it together on Sunday roast, which is regarded as more English. If you think about two things as English, British food, one is a Sunday roast. I hope you are making some for tonight, for today, because it's Sunday.
No.
And the second is the fish and chips, right? So that's actually one of the two famous dishes, so-called British food. Okay, well, thank you, Chen 老师，谢谢。
It's all right.
Yeah.
I think my idea behind it is since Christmas is an English festival, English holiday, so I might as well, it's okay, you know, that we try to make some English food, but we also celebrate 端午节 with 粽子, you know, we also handmade our own 粽子. So I just want to give this additional information so that
brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Chen 老师. Anyone else has a different traditions of favorite food for their Christmas or 端午节 or all these sort of more British or West traditions of a festival or more Chinese festivals? Perhaps let's focus on Christmas. Anybody has any different plans for Christmas?
祝教授可以发表一下我的意见吗？
好的，
我在这没有，就是也没有家庭，就是一个人在这，但是只要是圣诞节就会有德国的朋友邀请我去他的家里，然后我是入乡随俗，他们吃啥我吃啥，但是有时候他们就会提议说，哎，你们能不能做个什么中国菜？然后我就会给他们做一顿中国菜，就是表达对我的感谢，就是这样。
很好，很好。What do they usually have for Christmas Day? Your friends?
就是我的朋友 ，my friends. 我 usually they have, they also have like a German, food. It's kind of the
德国，
就是德国的那种烤鹅，我不知道
我
您
知道他们是吃烤鹅的哈，因为 goose is the sort of the most popular Christmas meal for Germans, yeah.
还有很多很多肉，就是鹿肉，各种肉。
Reindeer.
对。
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so you see there are two things. Actually, thank you very much for both of you. There are two things we have heard from the kind of the tales about which food on Christmas Day or on the more traditional West festivals. There are differences depending where you are, whether you are in Germany, whether you are in Britain, and there are some consideration for what kind of things, and there are practical reasons. You go with what your friends offer, and there is also practical reason. Yorkshire pudding is tasty, so why not? Okay, and so. But I'm going to show you a family interaction that I hope you find some of the discussion sounds familiar to some of you. And this is really about Christmas, the family talking about what they're going to have for the Christmas day. And the conversation involves the parents and their child. So I'm going to actually show you the transcript on the screen. I hope you can see. So this is the first part, and if we all finish, I can move on to the second slide. So what does the story tell us? What sort of thing did you pick up from the story? This is perhaps familiar interaction that can happen to any of us, talking about whether it's turkey, goose, or dumplings for Christmas.
Well, obviously we see conflict or different opinions of what they should have for Christmas dinner, and the generational argument. Very typical, I would say. 应该是非常典型的一个争论吧。And then of course it always also involves the discussion about identity. Are we British? Are we Chinese? Are we British Chinese? Yeah, interesting, very interesting conversation.
So thank you, Chen Laoshi. Okay, so what we have seen here is a couple of things. Chen Laoshi is absolutely right. There is clear intergenerational differences here, isn't it? You can see parents and the son. Why do you think there are such intergenerational differences on the food? What kind of food? I mean, intergeneration, yes, but then behind this intergenerational differences, what actually make people in their adulthood, 40-year-old for this couple, and their child who by the way is 17-year-old, is a son, is a boy who actually was born and grown up in Britain. What do you think that's actually make that intergenerational difference more significant? So what we have see here is actually, you know, on one hand is intergenerational differences, but what makes intergenerational difference more significant, more different than differences, if you see what I mean, in this example. Susan, are you?
Yeah， 我觉得就是说年轻的他就是试着就是要进入英国的或者说就是欧洲的这个的这个习俗，因为他就是坚持就是一定要吃 turkey。那父母亲因为他们可能不是在这里不是在英国长大吧，所以呢就是就觉得好像吃 turkey 就没味道。那因为我自己呢，我是属于是这个大家族的，我自己是在我们属于是华人，那在辽国出生，然后就是移民到就是难民到德国来。那我们一家人呢，也就是因为我母亲她那一边呢，也就是已经有8个兄弟姐妹。我们自己呢也是有8个兄弟姐妹，所以呢，我们每次这个过圣诞节的时候呢，我们也就是试着说，因为那时候小孩子小的时候就说，因为过春节的话，不是说春节每个人都有休假，那圣诞节的话呢，每个人都有休假，当然就是说想集合，就是一起过节。那当然吃的时候呢，父母亲他们也是不习惯说吃德国餐，所以我们大多数我们都因为大家族嘛，所以就说每个人就是每一个小家庭做一道菜来，就是谁最喜欢吃，然后谁知道说谁最喜欢吃的菜，就做那一道菜去，然后就是一起吃，所以我们也没有说坚持，就是说一定要有什么，就是说只是最主要就是说要一起过节，就开心的过节，对，
太好了 ，Susan 啊，谢谢你啊。By the way 啊，在这 Zoom 上我看不到所有大家，所以如果大家想come in 的话，就自己或者是如果 missed 的话 ，just switch on the microphone or 习英老师 can help because when you share screen you can't really see everybody. So do come in. Even if I haven't actually spot you. Okay, thank you. 谢谢 Susan. That's actually really interesting to see what the purpose, you know, the festivals for. For Susan, you actually, you know, you're talking about this purpose of the festival is actually big family reunion. The part of the reason is actually really to sort of make it easy for this big family and people bring in different dishes. That's a very practical management of a festival occasion when everybody can actually see each other. So clearly in this conversation, we see there is intergenerational differences, but the intergenerational differences intersect is 交叉 overlap or sort of they interact with differences in what people see the festival purposes. People think the Christmas is for and how people celebrate. In this particular example, the son who actually grown up in UK, they seem to have a different expectations, different cultural norms for Christmas. And for him, having turkey is being part of a Christmas. For the parents, perhaps, it's his festival day. So festival days, they are from North China. 饺子 is a must, dumplings is a must, anything, and then the parents emphasizing anything tasty. You know, for parents, perhaps, you know, it's not just about the traditions and one thing, but they also want to some practical options, something tasty, something nice, dumplings, roast duck, for example. So, in addition, what we have seen as Chen Laoshi and Susan commented, these are differences. What parents and children are doing here, you know, they are clearly we see preferences for different kinds of food, but what they're doing here in this space is navigating differences and identity. So it can start something sounds really mundane, minor, 很小的事, but then the conversation ended up with very big discussion, British Chinese is still Chinese. And that's the title. I really like this extract, and I use it as part of the title for today's talk. So starting from very minor thing, and all the way ended up this very big claim, British Chinese is still Chinese. And it's all about identities. It's not just about food anymore. It's about intergenerational differences and intercultural differences, and it's about identity. So that's really I'm hoping to look into a bit more today, and understanding cultural identities is also part of understanding where's the culture in language learning, where is the culture manifested, and how many different ways culture can manifest itself in language learning, and how we actually what consideration do we need to take in language learning, in addition to learning grammar, in addition to learning vocabulary, pronunciation. Culture is very important, and one of the area culture manifests itself, particularly to heritage family, is interculturality. So these are actually the sort of the key message we can pick from the story. Intercultural differences intersect with intergenerational differences, and how people navigate differences and identities and doing interculturalities. So here I use the word navigating. In some places you probably can have come across other words like negotiating. So I'm kind of hesitant to put negotiating. In my early work, I did talk about lots of negotiating. It is negotiating, but I also feel when you negotiate, there is an assumption, there is a sort of equal power dynamic in negotiating. You have a similar weight in the negotiation, but I don't think it's a level field all the time, level play field all the time. So I think navigating perhaps is more accurate way of describing what we have seen in the extract. And of course, ended up we're doing interculturality, and the cultural identity is a big part of language learning. So what I'm going to do is the key message is language learning creates an intercultural space where learners and younger generations have opportunities of not only learning the social cultural norms of heritage language, but also playing an active part in constructing, developing social cultural identities creatively and critically. So both are very important. Creatively is the example how people actually navigate this and resolve these differences with creativity, but also in reflections, looking at finding solution, how their criticality demonstrate in the interaction, through interaction. We learn through interaction. We also learn and then we also learn from interactions. And I'm going to draw examples from multiple two projects today. So a couple of slides about so what do I mean by interculturality? So 在中文里我们说跨文化交流，这个跨字呢，实际上呢，因为 you translate to back to English, it can be cross or inter. 我们就所以有的时候这个 translation equivalent is a bit of a headache for people in intercultural communication. 因为咱们这个中文的这个跨这个词呢是有两个含义的。那么在这个 interculturality 呢 the word is actually in English context at least is actually means different from cross cultural communication. So the interculturality is very often sometimes is regarded as a state of being intercultural. So as a social ideal, there is a lot of public discourse which sometimes confuse interculturality with multiculturalism. Multi means 多文化 ，inter 呢指的是文化的交叉性、建构性 in some of the work I have translated as a 建构性, trying to avoid the problem. You have to say 跨. And intercultural 作为一个 public policy discourse, interculturality is very much regarded as the outcome of contact and dialogue between different groups. For example, the European Commission described interculturality or interculturalism as a dialogue between different cultural groups, which will enable individuals to more readily deal with today's more open and complex environment. And that's actually very much regarded as European Year of Intercultural Dialogue. And within the UK, there are 2 reports that's actually very much emphasize interculturality. There is some backlash against the term multiculturalism in Europe, but I think in German, multiculturalism may still have lots of followers and currencies. Multiculturalism referring 多民族化, but the emphasis is very much actually people, different community exist in parallel with each other. So if you think about the picture, you see often, sometimes I see the pictures almost like the vegetable, selling vegetables. Tomato, for example, multiculturalism, you can have one tomato next to tomato, there's no interaction. That's kind of multiculturalism in very simplistic terms. Interculturalism, more about interaction between different paths. And in terms of the social ideal, is regarded as a sort of like one step or alternative model to multilingualism. And elsewhere, interculturality is also is actually defined as interaction between cultural exchange and communication, where individuals recognize and accept the reciprocity of the other's culture. So it's not just actually interaction, but more about recognizing others' culture, more accepting, tolerant. What I like about this definition is actually it defines more imaginatively what inter represent. It's about interaction, it's about sharing, and it's about the complementaries, and it's about recognition of different other cultures. And it's about the way of being and also bring multiculturalism a step further. So this is the definition coming from influential network on cultural policy, looking at international network. Okay, so as a research paradigm, so that's the public policy in terms of public discourse. Within the research paradigm, as within the intercultural communication specialist, interculturality is very much regarded as a research paradigm that moving away from the traditions seen in the work by many social psychologists. You probably have come across these social psychologists before, and they are very popular. And anytime you go to, maybe you just, when you Google, check something, it will pop up talking about cultural dimension by Hofstede and Charles Hampton Turner and von Trappenar's work and Louise. So these actually sort of the charts on the slide talking about how people use these different dimensions, for example, social distance, power dynamics, collectivism, to categorize different culture. And because they have a visual, it sometimes sounds more intuitively appealing, but then there are lots of criticism within the academic, at least within the academic world, that critique Lee's essentialism approach. And we'll come back to that in the next slide. Okay. So the problem with these work represented by Hofstede, these very much from the psychologist approach, is I see interculturality is a priori condition. So say something a priori means they actually something exists before experience, something we assume exists without actually empirical evidence. We know they exist. So in a way, we're talking about how do we know these differences exist? we have no empirical evidence to demonstrate these existence of differences. How, for example, if you say China is collectivist versus German is individualist, what empirical evidence can you say? Does that mean every Chinese is collectivist? So we have seen in our experience, we have perhaps come across examples. Actually, within this collectivist label, we do not necessarily behave all the time according to the textbook set by the Hofstede. And the other problems is cultural normative patterns are feasible and applicable. Okay, so this is perhaps something we can step back a bit more, looking at, do you believe there are cultural norms, or do you believe to what extent do you think cultural norms exist, and how do you actually describe a culture in such way? How do you actually the other problem with the dimensions, the patterns, what you have see on the first slide is this is probably the more serious problem with this model is with this kind of model, the inherent assumption is they are systematically causal, meaning if you are from China, you are from German, you are from UK, you behave, your starting point thinking about cultural value, and then that's why you behave certain way. And we know we don't really behave that way. There are spontaneous behaviors that not necessarily caused by particular cultural value that we're thinking about, because we are collectivists that behave like this. And cultural differences determine speakers, strategies, and sources intercultural miscommunication. The last one is sort of an epistemic headache for lots of interculturalists. The intercultural communication is funded by Edward Hall in 1950s, just after the Second World War. And he sort of worked with, he himself is an anthropologist, and he worked with linguists to provide training for American institute that actually trains American diplomats who are going to be posted in the Far East, for example. And he realized these diplomats not only do not speak the local languages, but they have very little knowledge of the local customers' practices. So they set up these courses. But then the problem with, they did a great job in highlighting, there are intercultural differences in the way we interact. But the problem is these cultural differences do not necessarily determine speakers' discourse strategies all the time. And then therefore, people, for lots of cultural researchers, the assumption is because there are cultural differences, they behave differently. But they are not necessarily true all the time. And I always believe in the intercultural interactions, most of the time is that situatedness. From the examples we have heard from Chen Laoshi, from Susan and Chen Laoshi, it's very much about situatedness. What's the local context? If you are a big family, you have a practical approach. And if you like Yorkshire pudding, you go all the way to homemade the Yorkshire pudding. So these local factors are equally important in interaction, if not more important than the so-called cultural dimensions, a cultural pattern with behavior. So coming back to this more criticism, I can skip this because I think we cover more or less. In terms of the within the interculturality research, and there is because of these problems we have seen with the cultural patterns dimension approach, there is a new line of inquiry. I call it interculturality as doing. So intercultural is not something being, is not something is, but something we do. So emphasis is actually dynamic construct, the differences, and how these actually emerge into through the interactions, and then also doing through the cultural identities, they are not static entities. They're not there. In particular, we think about particularly in the family language context, when the children are growing, they are learning, developing cultural identities, and that's where the cultural differences perhaps come through as a more dynamic construct than other occasions, and they are negotiated and constructed through discourse, and in some cases, in the interaction, new social cultural identities are brought about and created. So the second part is actually very important in understanding the where I started in this talk is not just we're not just actually navigating differences, but in navigating differences, we actually bring in making new social cultural identities, either in longer term or short term through discourse, through interactions. And this actually reflects a postmodernist understanding of the role of language in society. Language is not just a means of communication, but it's a way of doing things, and it plays an important role in changing society, because it actually mediates the way, offers us a lens and approach to understand society, and also offer us a means of constructing reality. So there's a bit more sort of things that we can talk about why we're talking about interculturality as doing. So it's a discursive, it's a constitute through discursive social interaction. That's one. Agency, and I think the interculturality as a doing emphasizes the agencies of human agents. We're not just a part of this big culture that's actually we have no part, we have no say, but we very much actually is live and kicking and make differences to who we are. And focus is not on comparison, but on process and what comes out of actual interaction. It's not just about whether somebody, a child who are born here, grown up in a Chinese family, whether they actually learn whether they are becoming British or German, but it's about understanding the process and what comes out of cultural interaction. So the quotes on the slide is one of the things I feel very much reflect the discussion, the interculturality as doing approach. So we became who we are through discourse and social interaction. So within the diasporas, the heritage community, language learning and social, why culture is a very important part of language learning and also socialization. The language is a means through which one is socialized into one's culture. And then for the language socialization, there are two purposes. One is learning to speak language in a way appropriate to the community, and at the same time, adapting to the beliefs and norms associated with speaking. So in language learning and culture learning, there is an approach called language socialization that talks about the reflexive relation between language and culture learning. When we actually learn to say, yes, please, this is actually one of the often used example when talking about language socialization. When you actually ask the children to say, what do you say? Yes, please. That kind of interaction, you're not just actually teaching them to say yes, please, but also in the yes, please, they're actually learning the politeness norms. You need to be polite when you actually asking something, requesting something. Please is a magic word that you can use, and in doing so, socializing the children into the society norms of politeness. But there are challenges facing diaspora communities, because there are substantial differences in cultural traditions as well as social practice. And I think many of you, us, will have recollection of these differences. There are not only, we have the what we see as the cultural traditions, but also social practices. And there are differences between the home culture and then the local culture. And the process of migration is also very relevant. I think this is we're talking about secondary migration. We're talking about returnees migration. Having lived in Britain, Germany for a while, returning back to China, and returnees, and that have a different experience. And secondary migration, talking about for people who may have, for example, when they come migrate from Hong Kong, they live in Europe for a while and then settled in a different place. Those kind of experience makes a differences, and we add actual layer of complexity of navigating cultural traditions as well as language traditions, which languages, language proficiency. And for us, and I think this is really important. So on top of navigating cultural differences, younger generation, they are actually have their own issue and their key issue of developing at a particular age, so because of their age. So they are in enormous circumstances, for example, compare with their peers from monolingual family, people who actually from the local community, they do not necessarily, they actually have relatively easier path. But then we're talking about for teenagers, they also have this critical formative years when actually navigating identities. We're talking about 逆反期, 青春期等等. So on top of that, for the diaspora community, in addition to this usual challenge facing teenagers, identity crisis, identity formation, they also have this additional task of navigating these complex rules of differences in culture, differences in language beliefs and ideologies, as well as social practices. I think for lots of the Chinese diasporas, we look different. And I think within the diaspora, you also have this so delicate differences, the visual differences. We look different from the local community. That make us stand out. Compare, for example, French migrants living in UK, they look similar. So they don't, it's kind of like a second different degree of differences. For lots of for people who are interested in this kind of a different migration, for example, there are some research from Turkey, for example, they call because they look European, sometimes they're embedded, they don't really feel they're treated as a white, but they kind of secondary white because they're not the same as a French, German, in that hierarchy, they're lower down in the hierarchy. And I think there are some research talking about invisible whiteness, talking about very unique experience of looking similar but being different. But for Chinese diaspora community, I think there is a critical issue of visually we look different, and people would have a different expectation when you look different. And I have on the slide also have language ideologies. I think this has been talked about yesterday. Perhaps Xiaolan Lao Shi has talked about the views of about social cultural values of different languages. They code, we code, which language is they, which language is we. The language we feel is our one language, home language, the favorite language, or heritage languages, compare with they code, whether it's local, whether it's third languages. Many family can be multiple. If you are in an intercultural marriage yourself, and there will be additional language, and then there's also language varieties, different social linguistic values of different local languages. Glasgow language, I worked in Newcastle for 10 years, and they speak very heavy Geordie accent. And my older son, actually, we moved to London when my older son was 6, and you can still tell a little bit Geordie accent in his way of speaking. I couldn't tell because I kind of lost that sensitivity. But then when he started school, the teacher actually came to us and asked, "Oh, have you lived in Newcastle before?" It was a quite nice surprise to discover that actually, having left Newcastle a while ago, but people can still tell the accent. And the differences in language ability of different generation, and that's actually a very important factor in the different generation. If you have a grandpa live with you, you can see clearly they tend to first generation or grandparent generation tend to have a stronger ability in Chinese and less ability in English or the local language, and the parents, depending the context, you may have a sort of okay English, okay Chinese, and then when it comes to the next generation, the child generation, younger generation, you have a stronger local languages and slightly worrying to many parents and worrying language proficiency in Chinese. Okay, so for in terms of the language socialization series, the traditional series of socialization often see the child as a mere recipient of process. So in that classic example, what do you say when you pass the banana to the child? The child is supposed to say, "Yes, please." So in that kind of a classic example, the child as a mere recipient, the process, they get a praise, good boy, good girl, if they did the right thing, and perhaps a banana afterwards. But then the postmodern, more constructivist approach that to language socialization emphasize the dialogic nature of socialization. So it's no longer the child as a recipient, but the more seeing child as an active and creative social agent, produces, construct, and negotiate the identities and shapes and impact on the identities of those with which they are socializing. So this is actually supporting the key message, in the language socialization, child is no longer just a recipient passive part, but they are active player in this interaction, making difference, and through their interaction, they also make contribution and change the social cultural identities of people who they are interacting. So changes are possible. Sometimes changes may be subtle, you may not notice, but it is possible. So I'm going to talk quickly about the first project that emphasized the, okay, yeah. So the talk is very much actually hoping to, the examples I'm going to use is actually showing the examples where the learners, younger generations of the diaspora community can play an active role in constructing, creating their own social cultural identities. And there is a new kind of interculturality that will emerge from the intergenerational talk in diaspora family and classroom interactions. So how people behave, how people navigate when somebody said British Chinese is still Chinese, and how does these cultural identities play out in interactions at home, social interactions in the classroom, how the new identities and possibilities, where the possibilities of negotiating these interculturalities are in language learning teaching space. So the first one is about a project, is coming out of my early work on AHS, or one of the projects funded by Research Council. It's about address term and naming practice. This is perhaps the more classical area that would be lots of social linguists would be interested in, address term. But then in the migrant situations, particularly for the Chinese community, there is also complexity of naming practice. Xing Laoshi at the start of the talk, talking about they taught me a new word. Lehrkraft is 老师, and there are something else. Xing Laoshi, could you explain what does a Lehrkraft mean in German?
Lehr, das ist auf Lehrer 就是英语里面就是老师 ，Lehrer 或者 Lehrer 就是老师，因为它分阴性和阳性。Kraft 是说这是一个力量，它的本意是力量，但是在一起就是师资，就是说老师。我这个头像名字是 Konfuzius-Institut， 就是说我是在孔院工作的老师。
Okay, I see. Right. Okay. So these, yeah, we all have very resourceful, creative way of using different names on the Zoom, as I can see, going through the name. So naming practice for the Chinese diaspora is also interesting. I have students who come to class with the name Strawberry, Cherry, Lily. It's and then sometimes my colleagues ask, how would you like us to call you? They're slightly puzzled by this wonderful selection of names. And that, how do you actually choose and introduce yourself, present yourself, is actually quite interesting in terms of looking at the Chinese language practices. So that's actually the focus of the first project. How does naming practice and address term, through these address term, we do interculturality. Oh, the other part, as big part of address term, and people whenever we talk about Chinese address term, we have to talk about kinship term. Kinship term is, again, it's a complex system. It needs a whole day to explain the Chinese kinship term. But it's important, I guess, to remember the kinship term, although compared with sort of relatively simple system of address term in English, in German, this kind of complexity is actually not just unique to Chinese. It's the same. I think they're all in, for example, East Asian cultures, Japanese, Korean. They all have very complex kinship terms. And I have worked with one PhD student of mine who actually came from Arabic, English, multilingual family. And Arabic address term is also very complex. And it's, so the address term, kinship term, it is actually quite interesting in phenomena, but the complexity of the kinship term is shared across many languages and many cultures. For the Chinese address term, the kinship term is very much interpreted as a way of establishing solidarity and using a kinship term to gain compliance. It's not necessarily gain compliance, that's how I feel, but more about sort of a way of reflecting how we see social relationships through family kinship terms, and how these the boundaries between the 大家、小家和 society can be blurred through kinship term. I think I don't really need to, well, maybe this is a fun example, bilingual naming practice. I don't know whether you have picked up this. We have a different, in addition to have this usual headache of which bit is your surname, which bit is your first name in the daily, everyday conversation. Many of us probably have to explain which bit is your surname, which bit is your first name. In addition to that, we also have this, different naming practices. Jackie Chan, for example, you can see Jackie. There's a differences in the order of his English name and Chinese name, Chen Long, but he presents himself as a Jackie Chan in English. The other is Zhou Runfa. Just randomly pick these examples. Zhou Runfa, you can see differences. In his case, he put his Chinese name first in English. Zhou is his surname, and Runfa. And how does the people who actually don't really understand Chinese know which one is which? So this is actually quite a complex naming practices, and the way to what extent we are following the Western tradition in naming practices. My surname is Zhu. I have actually always published in English as a Zhu Hua. And every time when it comes to the proof, I have to have this debate into the text editor, copy editor, and explaining which bit is my surname and how I would like to be presented in publication. And interesting, I think things are changing. In the early days, occasionally I got very polite but very firm rejections from publisher. They basically say, okay, this is the tradition, convention we need to follow. But now things are much easier. And I mean, they actually, I think very recently in Multon publisher, when they came back with my proof, they actually asked, how would you like to your name to be printed in the article? And I thought that's really positive development in this conversation about decolonizing and decentering English word and recognizing different practices in the in naming practice is a step forward. So the moving on to I mean, this is probably people are all aware here today. You know, it's quite common to have names in 2 languages in Chinese diaspora communities, and depending on who you're interacting with. And it's partly perhaps for ease of communication and partly as a way of fitting in the new culture. And patterns use, and I think this is the more hypothesis rather than empirical, backed up by empirical evidence. So patterns, and my suspicion is, I don't know to what extent you recognize these practices. So when both names are known to a speaker, the choice made by the speaker during the interaction is significant and meaningful, symbolizes the social and cultural membership the speaker would like to invoke. We're going to see an example in the interaction example on the next slide, and then you can see how family negotiate these different names and different address terms, different kinship terms in their conversation, and how in navigating these different address terms, different naming practice, they are also navigating their Chinese orientation and different orientation to different kinds of identity. But because there isn't any more obvious place to look at to do cultural identity than the kinship term, address term, and different names in English or in Chinese. So there are 3 slides. I'm going to go through one slide by slide, but I'm going to leave you a bit of time to look at each slide. So this is a multi-party conversation, parents and their teenage son, Jeff. The family moved to the UK when the husband was given a university research fellowship. And then they moved to North England. And the son was 5-year-old when they settled in UK. And he learned to speak English within his first 3 months of schooling. And then at the time of recording this conversation, Jeff was 11, and their parents are in the 40s. So as you see in this conversation, there is extended discussion about use of address terms. The conversation starts off with they're talking about somebody coming to visit, and then referred this friends as Uncle Liu. Jeff, however, doesn't recognize, forgot who Uncle Liu is, and the parents are trying to help Jeff to recall the person by mentioning somebody associated with Uncle Liu, and this triggers the subsequent discussion of the sort of everything really, social, cultural, and linguistics appropriation of address term. Okay, so we're moving on to next slide. We'll come back to these example after we have seen all the extract. The challenge of using the transcript is actually they have to working with PowerPoint is no way you can fit it in one slide. So have to bear with me. Are there any particular part of this conversation on this slide that caught your eyes and you find it interesting? Feel free to raise hands if you. Xing 老师, your first one. Thank you.
I think here 爱称 is very interesting because it's like 不是那个爱称是对人表示敬爱 and Jeff said you fancy him then is very interesting. Like for Chinese children, I don't think people the children in China will ask such kind of questions.
It's interesting, isn't it? 爱称 we know what it means, but when you translate, if Jeff, clearly is still learning Chinese, and for Jeff, 爱称 if you break down it into a literal translation, it could be love, but there is a different when you talk about 爱称. Okay, and then the mom actually very clever. I think she must be a linguist. No, she isn't. But we all become linguists when we come to family language learning. She was explaining it's actually endearment. It's showing respect, kind of endearment. Okay, so anybody has seen anything else that you find actually interesting?
我觉得挺有意思的，就是那个，这个 Jeff 这个小孩子，他和他的父母知道同一个人，但是因为他们用不同的称呼那个人，比如说小孩子知道的是他的英文名字，大人可能知道的是那个孩子的另一个孩子 Jenny 还是 Christian 的中文名字。所以虽然他们这是在说同一个人，但是他们不太确定，甚至都不太确定是不是说的同一个人，因为他们有不同的称呼嘛，这个是很有意思的。然后还有一点就是说这个，小孩子说这个刘盖，然后大人就说我这是你说的吗？你应该是刘叔叔，你怎么这个这么一个 guy 是吧？在英文是比较随意的一个称呼，就是谁都可以说的。所以这个是非常有意思的两个点，就是对，就是如果要说的话，就是引申出来，就是我们在中文里的话，就是你对每个人都要有一个尊称嘛，就是都是叔叔阿姨。对，这里也都说了，对，这个挺有意思的，
挺有意思的。谢谢陈老师。
老师，我有别的看法，我觉得这个好像这个就那个 Jeff。他不认同那个叔叔，就一个亲属称谓转化成一个社会称谓。就是我觉得这是可能是属于他已经是那种，就咱们那个中国人就已经很习惯了，就是说这个叔叔啊，既可以表述亲属称谓，也可以用于社会称谓。那种对吧？就表示一种尊称了，就对人家的。但是我觉得这个 Jeff 就是那种，就那种，就我觉得就是已经是那个。就是可能或者西方人的观点，他是不认可这个，他说叔叔就是一个亲属，他不是我的叔叔，对吧？他是还是属于那种亲属称谓，对他那个第一意义的理解，这是我的看法。
谢谢尹老师，是尹老师是吧？刚才是，
对，
谢谢，非常说的非常好，我觉得是的，我觉得是从一个on the first slide 就是说他这个 Jeff。They don't even know whether they're talking about the same person because same person have different names. So what it means is actually in naming practice in English, Chinese, they seem to trigger different kinds of a social map. If you think about the relationship, social relations as a map, they seem to have a different cognitive memory about social relationship. And then these little things, for example, Jenny, these names are tiny little things we do with our languages, But with even these tiny little things make huge differences to which sort of schema, which map, social map it trigger in the interaction. That's actually, I think that's the first thing. Second, I think what we have discussed, 陈老师和殷老师还有这个席老师都are talking about this. It's actually interesting. This where does the family address term fit in this child's his social world? For him, clearly there's the difference means where you draw the boundaries between the address term, family kinship term, and social relationship. I can just imagine for Jeff, his social relations is very flat because he doesn't actually see the Liu Gai is 叔叔 is reserved for family member. In his little book, he probably learned from the textbook or from somewhere else. 叔叔 need to be the younger brother of his mother or his father. Just the father's younger brother is 叔叔. Not we have different terms, and then he doesn't think anybody who's actually who might be his parents' acquaintance are equivalent to 叔叔 in Chinese cultural world, social cultural world. So there are differences. So that's actually two things from very mundane, ordinary conversation that perhaps could happen to you or us anytime in the day can actually bring in huge discussion about differences in cultural value. And then I think towards the end, this is actually for me the best bit is actually 称兄道弟, everybody does it, and the mom actually begin to talk about the favorite bit is turn 26 on this slide. In Chinese, everybody is your uncle. Imagine if you say that to your child, what reaction would you get? So this actually in the conversation is about the boundaries and it's about different kinds of social relationship in the society. And towards the end, the next slide is short, following the above conversation. They continue talking about the differences. 水管他叫大哥，是理发店 talking about this experience. Somebody called him 大哥, and that perhaps even add more shock to Jeff because the barber is clearly older than him. But then in following the customer relationship, in the way we address customer, everybody is your 大哥 in the customer service situation, and that's perhaps adds more shock to Jeff. And then towards the end, is a bit of a blurry on the slide. Jeff is actually talking about their beginning ended up in a very amicable situation. Jeff in turn 33. Thank you. 不刚当. He was trying to say 不敢当. Didn't, don't deserve it. But then when he used the wrong term, instead of saying 不敢当, he actually said 不刚当. And then the mother was quick to point out 什么不敢当? 不磕头啊. So it became a joke. But then in doing so, the mother is also gently facilitating him to use the right words. And in this kind of I would say this amicable disagreement discussion environment, humor, as you see, plays a big role. And then in doing that, the family is also trying to subtly introduce the language learning mode, trying to correct incorrect use of language, and then and in doing so, and also challenging navigating the differences. So there are many things we can say, out of this ordinary conversation, and I see this strategic use of naming and kinship term, address terms marks the people's social cultural roles. They're not only mark, but also makes their social cultural roles identities relevant to various degrees in different contexts. Clearly, they mark different social cultural interpretation of the social relationship, whether your social relation is flat, relative flat, or there needs to be hierarchical and showing respect, showing your customer relation, your social relations, whether you are a customer, whether they are your related, whether you are actually mere acquaintances. And then this kind of choices and avoidance, it not necessarily has to be the way we use in the example, or the decision not to use particular kind of address term, as well as the language speaker chooses. We didn't really go down to which language did they actually emphasize, which language did they actually resist each other, but together they actually carry significant complex cultural symbolic meaning, I would say. And this is through these subtle choices, or sometimes not so subtle choices, they make joke about it, talk about it, that speakers make explicit their social role they want to play, reinforce, and negotiate or navigate. So in doing in this social intercultural space, we see different social cultural identities come into contact and navigating. So this is actually quite interesting when I look at this data. One of the things I have always used, within the Chinese family, when people working on the migrations research often think about Chinese migrant family versus Polish family versus German family versus, and then Chinese family are very much actually treated as one homogeneous group, thinking about Chinese family. But in fact, in this kind of intercultural conversation, as you see, what we are doing exactly, there is interculturality within one conversation that's actually often labeled as one Chinese community. So we are different, and there are internal diversity. There is not only intercultural difference, there is not only intergenerational differences, but also intercultural differences, as we see in the Chinese family. And then this strategic use of the address term is part of language socialization process, in which younger generation of diaspora community not only internalize social cultural linguistic tradition, but also play an active role in constructing, creating their own social cultural identities, as well as the changes about the communities. And then and then looking at this interrelationship between language socialization and interculturality. So language socialization is one thing, the process that we see in teaching, learning, but also talking about what we do with language, and in doing so, how we create, navigate our cultural identities. And I hope this project demonstrates the changing dynamics within diaspora communities, and also provide an alternative approach to study multilingual practices within diaspora family to some extent. So that's a key message through the first project. And there are other things, many other things we can say. And I think you probably picked up the family, although there is a conflict, there is a tension, the family actually ended up with on a very happy, merry note. And that's actually, we can come back to that in the social cultural dialogue. We doesn't have to end up, fighting, screaming, not talking to each other. In the key to this, lovely conversation is the mutual, is the affection they have for each other. And that's actually, that's love, that kind of affection, family love, and then the care for each other keep this intercultural family together. And I found that's actually really important part of understanding, navigating differences within the diaspora community. It's not just any conflict talk, but the conflict talk situated around, centered around this our mutual respect for each other. So very quickly, I'll go through the second project, which I think I don't really, just really echo lots of things we have talked about in first project, but moving to a different context, to the classroom interaction. So we have seen the family, parents, children talk to each other, navigate, negotiate, and learn from each other. In the classroom interaction, how the socialization takes place. And I think the emphasis, as many of us here are teachers ourselves, so that's actually socialization teachings hopefully I'm trying to bring the connection between family language learning, cultural negotiation, and bring the drawing similarities between these different contexts, and also emphasizing, parents, teacher play an important role, but also we need to give space to the younger learner of our communities. So I believe some of the things Li Wei Lao has touched upon yesterday, talking about this is coming out from project looking at ethnography, doing ethnographic study in the Chinese complementary school in the UK. And then the students in the Chinese complementary school often resist. We have actually found they often resist socialization of teaching by posing challenging questions. They're not really sort of a deliberate set out to resist, but that kind of playful resistance, and that's we have often seen in the children growing up and sort of in this in the West. And there are also tensions for schools, teachers, parents. The emphasis we have talked about is very much on the set of traditional value and practice, and seeing children as primary Chinese, and they want them to be much similar to those in China. They may not want to be exactly the same, but they want to similar to those in China. And this is true in my own case as well. For the children, think of themselves primarily as British use of the Chinese heritage, but from the children's perspective, they start to position themselves as British use of Chinese heritage. And that's actually where the conversation can become a bit conflictual, even in the classroom as well. So apologize for the small font. Because I'm trying to fit everything in on one slide. I hope you can see. So this actually, I think Li Wei Lao actually used this example yesterday. We discovered we both like this example very much because it's about Chinese identity. And it's also linked with my first example talking about British Chinese is Chinese, that conversation. That statement, if you remember, is actually from the parents. And here is a conversation between teachers and students. I'll leave you a bit of time if you can read yourself.
老师，请问一下，这里面的 teacher 是这边的老师吗？是英国这边的老师吗？还是国内派来的，比如说汉办的老师？
这个我们采访的 complementary school 的那个老师是在当地的留学生，他自己也是家长。
OK。他来英国几年了？就是。
我当时没有注意，他是做 PhD 学生哈，他是不算很长时间，有5、6年吧，他是在30多岁左右。Does the interaction look familiar to you, or you found this is a quite strange conversation?
I think it's very familiar because yesterday we just saw this picture or this conversation.
Yes, familiar. Yeah.
I also read that in one of your papers.
Oh yes, thank you. Yeah.
By Professor Xiaolan, and paper written by you and Professor Li Wei. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that one appeared in an edited volume by Xiaolan. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So this actually conversation, perhaps what the teacher is doing, like all the language lessons, they started 我们中国人，我们是中国人 trying to actually this kind of a phrase, what better than 有主语谓语和这个 nationality talking about this kind of a practice. I can just imagine this is the conversation they use as a language drills. 我们中国人怎么样？我们英国人 as usually in the introductory chapter 在 第一节或第2节课都要教我是学生。我记得我当时学德语的时候，老师 spend a lot of time 教我是学生用德语。I forgot all about that now. Yeah, so these kind of sort of phrases are key phrases used in often you see in the textbooks and in language classroom. And in this particular cases, the teacher is trying to start this conversation, 我们中国人, but that triggered all the discussion we see here. Boys and girls, and there are about 11 teenagers, and they're talking about we are not Chinese. You are not Chinese. What are you? So throughout the conversation towards the end, the teacher become more reflective. So you are BBC, and then the student also asks her who you are. Teacher said, 我可以说是华侨 and British Chinese. No, I'm a Chinese living in Britain. You are British Chinese. Okay, Chinese British. So that's actually interesting conversation. You know, there are differences between British Chinese differences, and in Chinese there's differences between 华人 and 华侨. So these are actually quite complex conversation, and showing throughout the conversation, it became with a statement, started with a statement, 你们我们中国人, but became a sort of a much more sophisticated conversation about identities and about subtle differences. It's not just about negotiating identity, but becoming a lesson about subtle differences between 华人 and 华侨, British Chinese, Chinese British, or British or BBC, British for Chinese. And this is kind of I think in that piece of in that article we talk about this is the practice of co-learning, and in terms of what they learn, not just the linguistic knowledge, difference between 华人华侨我们中国人等等 this basic sentences, but the cultural values, different categories that's available describing themselves, who we are, and awareness of differences. I think toward the important thing is towards the end, both sides, the student and teacher, accept there are different identities. This is actually vastly different from where they started. They started talking about everybody is Chinese, and then towards the end, they accept there are degree of differences in who they are. 老师是华侨，学生们自己是 British Chinese, Chinese British, and British born Chinese, and that kind of a position seemed to be accepted by both sides. And then they began to question, reflect on identity, and it's interesting to see this discussion about hyphenated identity. The British Chinese is, I would say, the Chinese British, British Chinese is hyphenated identities, and we can have a different discussion about hybrid identity, whether these actually harmonious identity, how to what extent these British Chinese, Chinese British represent harmonious relationship, or there is also tension between in which fate it comes first. So this actually, I hope you agree, this is a good example, interesting example of how conversation and learning can take place, not just actually explicit learning, repetition, follow me, say after me, 我们中国人, but also perhaps more learning takes place in conversation. And this kind of a conversation requires teachers take a very different position on their roles. If teachers see themselves as authority, as the one who actually always knows best, I would imagine this kind of conversation is quite difficult to take place. But if teacher can step down a bit and reflect a bit more, and then recognize these, and then sort of make some difference to the unequal power relationships that we often see and then typically assume in the school setting, teachers as a giver, students as receiver, rather than we see that kind of unequal power relations. If we step back and see we are co-learner, we are actually having conversation, I think there will be more learning takes place in the language classroom particular about cultural value, identity. These are difficult but interesting conversation we need to have in the language classroom. So moving finish off, I hope I convinced you to some extent. Classroom and both classroom and home interactions are important sides of language learning and multilingualism, and in fact exciting research sites for me, but perhaps more important sides of language learning and the intercultural learning, where different language ideologies, beliefs, practices are competing with each other, and we see them in these differences come into contact into each other. But what we can do is we provide a safe space for children to context monolingual and unicultural ideologies. Unicultural, talking about one culture only, there is only one correct culture, or one culture is better than another. And hopefully we can actually create some space to step back from that mindset about only one culture is possible. But if we accept there are more than one culture in a particular space, how we navigate these differences. And then in doing so, we see new set of cultural identities come out of these interactions, and which will have a long-lasting impact on the Chinese diaspora communities and individuals of different generations. So that's the final slide, and thank you. And I think if we have a space here, we can talk about the more practical aspect, how we actually create these spaces. I'll stop there.
好，非常感谢朱华教授讲得很好，很有意思 ，very interesting. Thank you very much. 然后您刚刚讲到就是就是孩子跟父母讨论称谓的问题，我的同事跟我分享了一个很有趣的故事，我跟大家分享一下，就是我们有位同事叫穆老师，他有3个孩子。然后最小的2个孩子现在是处于青春期，然后经常因为一些事情发生争论跟小朋友们，然后他就告诉我，只要孩子们饿了或者有什么需求，他们就叫妈妈妈妈，然后只要孩子们跟他想要协商讨论，就是有一种权力的竞争，他们就不叫妈妈，他就说哎呀小穆，哎呀穆老师，哎呀，对，这个很有意思。是的，像您说的这个语言社会化，这是真的，孩子是通过语言去了解这个社会，知道在社会里面哪些行为规范是对的或者可被接受的，但同时他们又利用他们学到的东西去跟大人去沟通，或者去权衡，或者是为了达到自己一些目的，然后运用自己的语言，然后文化各方面的知识，我觉得孩子真的是，就是很有创造力。当然我不是穆老师，因为穆老师讲的时候就是有时候他就是情绪很激动，就是跟孩子这种争执，其实有时候是挺让他伤心的。对，好。
这些小孩子很聪明，真的是他们 they pick up these things very quickly, and then they are very resourceful. And then they are very aware of these different norms and different expectations, and how to mobilize these different, we call it resources, and sometimes people refer to them as repertoires. Repertoires is a lovely word. It's about what you have on your. It's almost like what do you have in your tour box, and then you pick up one, and then you use it to achieve what you want to achieve. I think that's a lovely word to describe this. Describe how multilingual and then these in many ways transcultural kids what they can do.
Yes, exactly. 这里有一位老师，就是殷老师，是对吗？殷老师是。对，打开。
你好，我也是想给朱老师提供一个案例啊，因为刚才听到就是那个老师跟学生之间就中国人、华人、华侨这个达成认同，是我10几年前，在15、16年前遇到的一个真实案例，就是因为东南亚华人对自己的身份认同是比较高的，我当时就遇到一个印度尼西亚的华人学生，他是 beginner， beginner，然后他就大概在中国，他来到中国去学习，然后学了大概一个多月，就挺困惑的跟我说，他说在印度尼西亚，他说当地人叫我们是中国人，但是我到了中国，中国人说我不是中国人，他就很 confused， 而且他会觉得两边都不认同他那种感觉啊。但那时候呢，我就跟他说了，就是我跟他说了一个华人华侨的概念呢，这个我觉得这个华人华侨概念就很多的就让他适宜了。所以我觉得中国人我们在用中国人这个概念的时候是有狭义跟广义之分，对吧？所以我觉得这个对他那个身份认同的这个案例就提供给朱老师，谢谢。
非常好，尹老师，我觉得这是说明了一个，就是这个 Chinese 这个中国人这个 term 是 linguistically ambiguous， 它是一方面有这个指的是 ethnicity， 这在东南亚他们觉得自己是 Chinese， 中国人是一种 ethnicity， 但是在国内呢，用这个中国人指的是一个 Chinese citizens 啊，
国籍上的，
对。而且更有一种typical 的 norm， 就是什么中国人，就是在这长大的都不一定是中国人，虽然就是在那长大的都不一定。比方说这个咱们国内就是这个朝鲜人，这个是一个非常 delicate 的这个 topic。那他们在当地长大的，那有一些是比方说是南韩过来的不一样留学生，但是还有呢，咱们在金边那边有一些自己的长大的土生土长的这个韩国人，就这个Korean ethnic background， 这些都比较 delicate 的这个 situation， 所以这个中国人这个概念确实是非常 ambiguous， 非常的这个难 define 的这么一个 term。好，
谢谢朱老师，
谢谢尹老师啊，丁老师你好。
谢谢祝华教授，朱老师，好久不见。
好久不见，太好了啊。
我就是想comment 一下，就是您刚才讲到的这个小孩子是非常敏感的，他们对于这个 identity 和这个跟这个他们的这个 identity associate 的东西都是非常敏感的。我自己儿子也是这样子，他如果做错了事情，他就会唱上学歌，唯一能唱的中国歌然后他会想我如果那个说，他有的时候还会跟我说如果我跟爸爸闹别扭了，他会说那我为什么还要姓这个？我就跟妈妈这个姓吧，这个姓丁吧。然后就这方面，然后比如说妈妈喜欢吃的这个零食这个瓜子这个要不你看个电影吧，今天看个这个中国电影吧，这是安慰我们两个。如果是有这个我和他要是因为他做的事情不对，如果生气然后还有一点，我觉得就特别的喜欢，就是你讲的那个例子，就是说这个 negotiation of identity 以及这种 power relationship 在家庭里边以及在这个课堂里边是随时都是在这个发生的。然后我觉得你举的那个例子，就是说在有这种的时候，因为经常会有一种 conflicts 就会有一些比较negative 的一些影响。所以你举的那个例子，我觉得特别的好，就是说怎么能够把这种可能的，因为这个 conversation 完全都可能。比如说爸爸就说你怎么这个，或者是妈妈就会生气了，怎么你总不懂我是经常觉得会有这种的，但是把它做成一种非常正面的，就把这种这种文化语言的交流，以及这种慢慢的帮他建立这种身份的认同，就是作为一个正面的一种经历，应该是我觉得是很好的。我有一个问题，就是您刚才就是有一个 slide 里边就是讲到了 interculturalism 和 multiculturalism，那我觉得就是这两个的概念是不是一样？你是怎么定义它的？然后还有就是我比较喜欢你就是说的这个British Chinese is also Chinese。那我的感觉是
那这个感觉应该是我们这一代或者说第一代的父母的一个 statement，或者说老师是吧？那这一代新的这个 the younger generation, second or third generation, to what extent they will echo with this. So what we can do to help maybe build this new, not necessarily the same identity we have.
丁老师，谢谢啊，您的点评，2个问题都一个，谢谢您的example， 而且 share 一下自己的亲身的这个体会啊。小孩子真的是非常聪明啊，我也是自己感觉到的。如果我的孩子if they are something, they want me to do something for them, they actually switch to Chinese, trying to get. And I know when they switch to Chinese, I know they actually need me to do something for them. Yeah. So that's a similar experience. So the questions you asked, the first one, the difference between multi and interculturalism. 我觉得这2个呢，实际上是在这个中文呢，一个是多，一个是这个我喜欢的把 interculturalism or interculturality 呢翻成这个文化建构性这样的一个差别。那么多文化呢，在德国，尤其是在这种欧洲大陆呢。体现的是在政策上，就是社会融入的政策上，实际上是在这方面 debate 是很多的。就在从这个这个文化融入上呢，在对 immigrants policy 这方面，那么在德国呢，尤其是据我了解哈，是在德国呢最早提出的这个 multiculturalism 这个政策，这是在80、90年代，就是讲的是在这个各个民族文化呢是共存的。就比方说 immigrants， 你不需要把他们trying to integrate, not trying to to make them become one of you 这种 policy 就讲是互相的 respect 啊。但是呢，在经过了一段时间，他发现这种，尤其是当时我们那个英国前首相 David Cameron 那段时间，他发现就是这种不融入对他们来讲，这种不融入的政策呢 didn't work。What they wanted， 尤其当时是911事件以后。他们就经过了一个这种政策上的一种反思，觉得这种不融入呢，容易呢，就是说更产生不同的，就是 gap 越来越大这种情况。所以当时从政策来讲呢，这个作为这个政策来讲，这个 immigrant 政策呢就变成了 interculturalism， 和更多的人在谈这文化建构性，就鼓励呢这个各个不同的community ethnic group talk to each other, interact, engage。and then 就理解互相的 appreciate 自己之间的 complementarity， 互相的这个文化的弥补性，然后呢互相的 reflexive 这样的一个政策 interculturality。那么在这个落实期间呢，大家可以想到，其实是这个没有一个政策会是 perfect 完美的，有一些就会有一些不能够融入的地方，比方说那个这个 religion。我们今天一点都没有提 religion， 但是 this is really big topic， 那个宗教性的这个不兼容性，这是一个很大的一个问题。To what extent do you call something is a cultural practice and that need to be respected? And to what extent in the legal term you actually need to protect particular kinds of practice, but then recognize this kind of particular cultural practice may cause harm to other people from different cultural groups。 所以大家可以看到，就是这个文化的这种，如果 interculturality 这种 immigrant policy 呢，也会有不同的这个问题。这是从这个政策上来讲。那么在这个学术上研究上来讲呢，这个 multi 呢 culturalism 呢，实际上是一个比较大的一个 term， 好像很多还没有太多的具体在这个 academic education， 尤其在 intercultural education 上呢 ，multicultural education 呢。实际上是一个非常 general term， 这个最近呢用了一些 interculturality 也好 ，intercultural education 呢更强调的就文化的就沟通性更强一点。那么在这个 applied linguistic 这领域里呢，我做的一些呢，就是通过这个引用了一些 constructivist 的这种 approach， 这结构主义强调呢这个通过 interaction 呢，我们不仅仅 had a conversation。But also in conversation 呢 ，something new coming out of it, particularly from the identity perspective。这是呢，就从这个大概的给您介绍一下，从政策上，还有这个从研究上这方面。那么这个 您的这个第二个问题呢是 British Chinese is Chinese. I think it needs to be a question mark. 就是说，实际上这个 I picked it because it's actually very thought-provoking because you can have a different all sorts of a combination mutation 不同各种各样的组合。British Chinese is Chinese or Chinese British Chinese 还有你加上中文的华人、华侨、中国人等等这些非常重要 significant identity maker or identity marker if you like 这些。那么 how we actually deal with it 就这些。我还觉得在这个思想这个反思中呢，还有一个就是 hyphenated 这个 culture. Is there such thing as a culture 就是这种 hyphenated culture？ 我觉得不同的这个理论呢会有不同的想法的，就是这个 hyphen to what extent 我们最近呢有一些人呢提出这个 transcultural transnational trying to 就是 downplay the differences in 这个不同的这个 you have to choose one or the other perhaps not do you have to live with a hyphenated culture 大家有人说呢这 hyphenated culture is not as good as a one culture 因为 it always means it's blended it's a bit of both it may not be as good as one culture so there is always a bit of a criticism so these actually I think ongoing discussion and I think that's something perhaps we start the talk as a British culture British Chinese is Chinese we'll probably finish today's talk with a question mark British Chinese is Chinese question mark and big question mark
对我觉得就是我在那个您在这个是这个的时候解释的特别好，这个有回音
有点回应
hyphenated 我在想就是这个 Chinese-ness 可以用就是说我觉得可能的就是有没有一种比如说 degree 这种 on a continuum 或者说是situated depending但是总起来可以说是 dynamic changing all the time
谢谢啊丁老师我觉得您这个 comment 是非常重要实际上我觉得这个 situatedness 呢是非常重要的考虑这个 identity 影响我们自己的身份呢也是在不断的 depending on the context 然后我就在2014年和2019年的这个我写的那个本书里呢也强调讲这个 interculturality 实际上是两方面的就是从一方面等于实际上是一个你别人看你的一个 identity how people see who you are 然后另一方面是你 how do you actually want to orient to就是你自己想把自己想怎么样 orient to 那么用的 different ways different means different resources 那这两个实际上这个 situated 在我们在这个 conversation 这么一个非常具体的情况下是把这两个呢在一起给 bring together 别人看你的还有你自己想怎么样 present 我经常举的一个例子就是说 question 这个大家可能都有被 quiz 过就是说 where are you from and where are you really from these are different questions where are you from asking where are you from and then where are you really from it actually shows they have a certain expectation about who you are I mean this kind of conversation perhaps happened to you before it certainly happened to me quite a lot the only place I would say is the only place I haven't been asked a question is actually in Washington when I actually went to a conference and the guy actually said oh are you from London at the hotel reception and then that was the only time actually I found who I am wasn't really quizzed wasn't really sort of a questioned我们孩子小的时候我们一起去泰国 long distance travel 然后我们 check in hotel 好像是很高的楼层然后我们下去找点东西吃很饿当时那个 restaurant 那个 waitress 就问 where are you from 然后我那个2岁的孩子就说我们从 upstairs I'm from upstairs 我觉得那是 best answer I have ever heard
我来分享一下如果我被问到这个问题 where are you from 我最近的回答都是 I'm from many places I'm from London, I'm from Hull, I'm from Germany, I'm from China, I'm from, Northeast England. 就是你曾经住过的所有的地方，你都可以说 That's where I'm from. 因为确实是你每住一个地方，其实你 你都会 pick up something and then that becomes part of you。 对，其实这个问题很有意思，就是而且往往是如果你是外国人，就比如说我们现在在英国，我们会被别人问 Where are you from， 然后经常我也必须要反问 Where are you from， Which part of England are you from， 就是说这个问题不是说就是他们单问我们就好了，我也总是一定要问 Which village are you from， Which town are you from in England， you know。 当然就是对，我觉得是非常有意思的哈。就刚才我也想在就是丁老师和那个朱华老师说的，就是好像我感觉是因为你用的是 navigating 这个词，我觉得是非常好。就是 I don't know if that's what you intended, but I feel that you are saying that both the parents or the teachers and the students' children, they are search for something together. They are going through something that's unknown to both adults or the teachers and the children. So we are navigating together. And it kind of plays down the power relationship, right? Because negotiating, it means often it means the stronger part and the weaker part is negotiating that, you know, who wins out. 但是 navigating 确实是很有意思，就是说我们都在这个我们不知道的一条路上走，我们也不知道我们的孩子，就是说我们现在是在海外教他们中文，我不知道我们的孩子其实最终他会选择 Chinese English 还是British Chinese， 我们不知道。而且我觉得我们作为大人或者说家长的话，不需要去给孩子一个标签，就是你不需要说我们是中国人，我觉得我其实不会这样子，就是去跟我的孩子强调，不太会。但是孩子自己会问的时候，我会就是尽量不要去说就把它固定下来了。但是我会说妈妈是中国来的，妈妈说中文。然后呢，我也会说，就是我很希望，就这个也是跟苑文李老师他们那个社区学来的哈，就是怎么跟孩子讨论这个事情。我自己的感觉是对您刚才说的这个 open process， 我觉得是非常非常的就是在日常当中其实还是可以去实践的。我觉得那样子的话，亲子关系也会比较和谐啊。就是说你不要压一个标签给你的孩子。对，反正还是学习了很多，我觉得非常有意思。就是包括这个您今天提到的这个称谓，我自己也是反思。最近的一个例子是什么呢？我的孩子，因为其实我觉得包括家长在跟孩子的这个关系当中，他对中文学习的态度也都是会有变化的。就是一个家庭，其实他也会有变化。不论是中家庭也好，还是中外家庭也好，比如说可能也是由于各种原因吧，我自己在孩子7岁之前呢，是没有很有意识的去说我要带孩子系统的学习中文。那么后来呢，就是也是因为非常幸运，就是遇到了苑文他们这个大家庭哈，我们说的或者集体，我觉得中文共学集体是比较好。对，然后就是触发了我自己要努力去带孩子比较系统的学习中文。尤其是古文哈，这个是会变化的。那么同时呢，与此变化的是我对孩子的称谓也确实是变化。以前我老是叫他 Constance， 他的英文名字。那么现在呢，我是没有例外的话，都是用中文名字叫他。中文名字呢，他有个小名和一个大名。然后有一次他的同学问他，他的小朋友问他，他说 Constance， 你妈妈什么时候叫你中文名字？就是他的大名杨佳琪。然后我的孩子给了一个回答，他说妈妈生气的时候叫我这个杨佳琪，就是他的大名。哎呦天哪，这个真是把我自己就是让我自己反思了一下。这个确实是，就是其实因为我们叫他大名的时候，而且用中文叫他的时候，而且我是生气的时候叫他，我也会觉得说我比较能够又有这个又好像是不意识的，可能不完全是有意识的哈，就是你想在某些时刻你是需要用父母的权威去让他做一些事情嘛，对，所以但是其实孩子非常聪明，他说妈妈生气的时候叫我中文的大名，不是小名，也不是英文名，把我给吓一跳。谢谢周老师。
这
因为我
非常有意思的，
对，因为我自己是社会人类学家，
而且是不是你家长生气的时候会连名带姓的叫？
绝对的，就是觉得特别的
有力量，对于你来说就是你要表达那一刻的愤怒，或者那一刻的挫折，就 frustration， 那一刻的你觉得是要用孩子的全名。当然在英文里可能就是他们也会，就比如说不可能叫孩子的小名了哈，就会把连名带姓是不是也会一起叫？我感觉应该也是会的，就是各种事情凑在一起了，intersectionality。对，谢谢朱老师。对，我就说了，我自己也是一个社会人类学家嘛，但是有时候其实你是不一定完全意识到你自己在做什么的。我只是想说，我觉得真的
是的，我们都是在就是这种，我谢谢您对我这个词这个 choice word 这个肯定，我也觉得 navigating 确实有一种就是说 not necessarily blind lead blind but we are in this together 那种感觉哈，就在一起。And there is no destination. We don't really know where the banks are, but we are navigating kind of like metaphors. Yeah. 我觉得这个 address term 确实是大家说起来真的是很有意思的。As a parents, and then there are other things. I think 我觉得这个就是中文这 address term 确实真的是非常丰富的这个 resource。昨天我在看电视，他自己把自己这是一个妈妈有2个孩子，他叫他家的老大叫哥哥，哥哥怎么样，弟弟怎么样？我觉得这样对这个咱们能理解的，他指的这个他的 reference point 是不一样的，就是在这个 address term 的期间呢，咱们这个reference point 还是不断的 move depending on the context。这个我觉得作为一个就是 non-Chinese speaker 学中文的话，他就不知道怎么办好，怎么样能把这个解释出来？就这个很多就这种 context specific change。Not only relationship, but also situated 的这种relationship， 这种是需要很长时间的学习才能体会到。
好，谢谢各位。刚刚陈伟璇博士提到这个问题，我就想语言跟权威性之间的关系，包括家长他用中文去表达作为家长的一个权威，那还有老师有时候要用一种语言来表达权威。我没有带过华裔班的课，但是有2次，就是我的同事，就说他能不能让我帮他带，我就带了2次课。然后我就想让这个课堂活泼一点，因为我本身很喜欢孩子，然后我就想做一些游戏呀，或者是唱个歌、跳个舞，就是用各种各样的方法来调动他们积极性。然后呢，我就发现这个权威性。我就被受到大的挑战，因为有的孩子跟我很熟，有的孩子是朋友家的孩子，有的孩子是经常来孔院，我会跟他们一起有时候玩。然后在孩子的眼里，他们就是把我当成一个玩伴，或者是一个朋友，或者是一个就不是一个老师。所以我就想，这种权威性有时候就很难平衡，包括家长也是，你怎么在一方面你要保证自己作为家长的权威，你能够让孩子去做一些他应该做的事情，然后另外一方面保持这种亲密性。我觉得这个有时候是一种比较难平衡的事情。我想听一下各位的意见。
我觉得刚才席老师说的是，其实我们这里的有好多的那个孔院的老师也会经历的，就是这里的课堂的纪律还是特别的这个不一样的，跟国内的那个老师的权威是不用建立就有的，那个这里的是一定要有纪律，有这个 class rules 好，我就想说这些，非常好。
其实这边的好多的这个教学习惯和国内的也是不一样的哈。比方说在那个，比方说桌椅的摆放情况，比方说这都是圆桌哈，这种摆的这种形式国内都基本上是一排一排的这样这些，其实都是就是 symbolize a different relationship in making。但是好像就是有些在language 教学期间，还是也需要强调这个纪律，有一定的纪律，有一定的 rules。才能够help to learn。我觉得这些是确实是就是权威性确实是蛮有意思这方面。
而且我觉得就是说，朱老师，还有各位老师，就是提到了这个，就是之前我觉得，可能觉得很重要，但是现在觉得越来越重要。这种语言课的这种identity 的这个这个特别特别重要，尤其是作为比如说家长也好，我们是在家里去那个教小孩，然后我们好多老师都在这个在当地的学校或者教学场所去，就是非常这种怎么说正面的去引导，而不是 impose，然后有很高的这种敏感性，然后也在尊重他这种他这种文化身份成长，我觉得还是这个非常有挑战性的，那个我觉得是非常非常重要的，
是的，我觉得这个是就是说这个 authority 的这个 mother as authority， 实际上在这个diaspora 这种海外的是一个非常 challenging 的，就是实际上是除了在国内有一些，比方说跟国内的这带孩子相类似经历，就是要 look after 像这些等等等等，还有一个从 language input， 这个妈妈呢也经常是作为自己，因为是不多的 language input， 所以他自己有自己的 authority， 他觉得自己是 language authority， 这就 add to 这个 complexity of the relationship。when you think yourself as authority， 就是 what do you do when 这个小孩有问题，就是说错了，什么时候你是如何改 ，to what extent 你改。刚才我们刚才 example， 这个妈妈还是很幽默，很像开玩笑，就把他这个孩子的错的用法给纠正了。我觉得这是一个挺好的，因为这个你要是老是就是作为这个 authority 老是不断的 correct 的话，孩子下次也许就不跟你说了，就是不再越少，或者这是一个非常一个 delicate 的。同时呢，我们大家又有 aware， 就如果我们不 correct，who's going to correct them 这个一个不同的这个不同的 needs， 但是在 deliver 的时候，是不是要大家考虑一下这个，如果能够有 energy 或者是有这个 mental space， 一定要想一下，就是 how do you actually offer support and then offer 这个 correction report， 这个 balance between fluency and accuracy。 我觉得在就是海外这个中国的儿童这个 encourage to speak 是 actually 是最重要的 ，rather than having the 就是 have to be precise on everything。It will come, the accuracy will come. 但是 the key is actually to protect their interest in speaking and using language. As long as they use language, language will live.
好，我可以说一句吗？
好的，
我听了就这3场讲座，原来我对这个华裔教育没有那么多体会虽然我也没怎么教过华裔学，但是我现在感觉好像语言学习就是说其实就家长就是华裔家长就让孩子学中文，我觉得可能语言学习并不是最主要的，最重要的可能是让孩子在这个学习中文的过程中，或者说在功能他能够因为就是我跟别人不同而有成就感，而不是因为我跟别人不同而有异样感。我觉得这个对孩子的培养可能是更重要的，就是也是昨天那个李轩老师说的那种文化自信，对吧？他对自己身份认同，就是我是有中国血统的孩子，或者是华人的后代，因为这种身份的不同，对这个身份首先认同，然后对此而且也有成就感，我觉得这是可能是最重要的，这是我的感觉。谢谢。
是的，是的，我觉得是就是这个语言呢学习呢，实际上不光光是学这个把这个 sentence put together， 是学多少单词多少个，而是呢就是说在这个学习间，你看我们讲的这个文化很重要 ，identity 很重要。实际上是在这个海外环境中，中文学习实际上是一个非常重要的一个 space。我们 sort it out these things that's actually we will not have time to sort it out in the mainstream classroom。这是很重要的这殷老师提出来的是这个，就是实际上我们用这个 language learning Chinese learning is not 可能 battlefield is really too strong but it is important and perhaps the only space we can and they can to actually to sort out other things that's actually specific 这些对这些在海外长大的孩子。因为很多的老师家长可能愿意花时间精力带他们学钢琴，打那个play tennis， 但实际上 language 呢 is actually more important， 就是因为这些涉及到其他的这些问题。
我非常同意。我虽然没有专门教过华裔学生，但是这么多年里面也有华裔学生学习，我感觉他们就是，而且我教的都是成人的孩子。特别是我现在教的一个学生他已经30多岁了，然后他主动的到孔院来学中文啊，他听说能力不错，但是这个读写能力不行。然后还有我以前也教过这些华裔学生，我就感觉一个很重要的，他支撑他到成年以后，他还自己主动的继续学中文，有一个很重要的原因就是他们都会说方言，他们从小在家里是跟父母是用方言对话的。或者跟父母，或者跟爷爷，或者跟爷爷奶奶、姥姥的那一代，所以他是有这个方言的基础，对这个东西。然后，当然这个有方言基础以后，他再学普通话其实是很快的啊。所以，然后我觉得他们肯定是对自己身份的，就从小可能对身份是有认同的，说他大了以后也不用再重建，所以他反而到了大了以后，就30多岁、20多岁以后，他会主动的去继续学习中文。
是的，我们现在看来越来越多的不光是就是这些就 first generation of a migrant family， 现在是 second generation， 有的时候是 third generation 随着这个 migration 这个 history getting longer， they actually come back to learn Chinese。
而且我现在这个学生挺有意思的，我就提供个案例给各位老师啊，他是在意大利，他说是在，我有点忘，他好像说是在中国出生，但是可能1、2岁就到了意大利，然后在意大利长大，然后好像是在英国读的大学，读的本科跟硕士啊，然后小时候呢也学过一点，去中文学校学过一点儿，他说但学的不太多，但跟家里是说那个温州话啊。方言，然后后来呢，就他找的那个在英国很多地方待过，也去过很多国家。然后他现在他的后来结婚，是个女孩子，然后他结婚，他的爱人是南非的，啊，然后也去中国做过一些研究。然后，但他现在就是很有意思，他做的工作跟中国会有一些比较多的关系，啊，他就从那种他的那种他应该也是一个。很国际的一个视角了，对吧？他去了很多的国家，然后来讲述一些跟中国有关的故事，从他的角度来做啊。这个也是一个，也不算是一个很稳定的、很一直的工作，他可能也在换啊。所以他现在他说他在上海待过3年，当时他的汉语不好，就是有一个翻译陪着他工作。但是现在他在伦敦，他说现在也没法去中国，他现在在伦敦反而开始自己到孔院学习中文，很有意思的一个案例。
真的是不错的这些，
好，非常感谢各位，也非常感谢我们的祝华教授给我们带来精彩的讲座。然后我自己感受比较深的一点就是这个认同是在不断变化构建中的，就是比如我们今天的谈话，比如我跟其他的同事的一些对话，或者是日常的经历，每一天都是在建构我的认同。对，每一天我的认同都在可能发生细微的变化，但是日积月累，可能1年2年以后，我现在的认同跟我2年以后的认同可能又有一些变化。对，所以我觉得这个很有意思，人就是在不断变化，然后不断的成长，就可能到了我等到70、80岁，可能认同还会再变。
是的，
好，非常非常感谢。好，那现在时间不早了，然后祝华教授真的是很辛苦。那如果大家下午还有空的话，欢迎参加我们的
谢谢。
下午就是苑文，还有我们的李校长，这个就是陈博士经常提到的那个苑者文之，他们在德国斯图加特创办了一个中文学堂，叫冠渊学堂。现在他们慢慢因为疫情，所以疫情期间是转到线上上课，但是他们很厉害，他们汇聚了全球大概2000户华裔家庭，就是有一个中文社区，他们每天会在社区里讨论一些 中文教学的心得。对，我自己也是在群里，虽然我没有孩子，但是看就是那些家长每天发的那些信息，真的是觉得哎呀，可怜天下父母心。然后一方面觉得哇，能够志同道合的人汇聚在一起，真的是一件很幸福的事情。对，所以我也很高兴今天能遇到大家，然后和大家就是讨论一些非常深入的话题。我觉得这种deep conversation 就是非常有意义。对，所以非常感谢大家。好，谢谢你们。好，谢谢祝华教授，
谢谢祝华老师。
好，谢谢 ，take care，OK，bye。